I'm Sheila Odonnell. I'm an architect based in Dublin in Ireland, a partner in O'Donnell and Toomey Architects, which I set up with John Toomey in 1988, so that's about 34 years ago. We work quite widely abroad and in Ireland, but we have I suppose our practice from the beginning has always been really based on the idea of immersing ourselves in places and understanding the nature of the place in which we're going to work and finding somehow a way of extracting the essence from a place. So we're interested in conversations with the material, the history, the social aspects of the place, but obviously we're not trying to imitate the old buildings, but we are very interested in the idea that architecture is built in the continuous present. So we feel when we're looking at a site that every other neighbouring building, whether it's built last year or 500 years ago, is all part of a context to which we're responding. So I think we're that sense of a kind of engagement with place, but also I would say a social engagement with use. I'm very interested in this almost a kind of psychology of the way spaces can make people feel either comfortable or uncomfortable, and we're always trying to make people feel comfortable. So we're interested in a kind of extending the threshold between the inside and the outside, so there's a place where people can relax and adjust and accommodate themselves before entering a building. Because I think for a lot of people, walking into a building, especially a public building, can actually be a little bit intimidating. So we certainly think in our work a lot about those aspects, about use, about comfort, about how people feel in space and in places. We started thinking about how we were making an architecture in Ireland, but now I think we're just interested in the nature of place in any place. And we found that by looking very closely at our local contexts, we've learned and understood a way to look at any context. So recently we've built in Budapest and London and the Netherlands, and we find we really enjoy the learning about a new place. Thank you indeed for the invitation to speak here in Porto in this wonderful building at this event named for the master architect Alvaro Siza. I'm going to read a short introduction and then I'm just going to speak to the slides, but I'll warn you now that you have not seen the end of the Nolly plan. So our work is deeply engaged with place, in how to respond to the particular characteristics of each site and also in how to make places within our buildings. We're interested in making places between inside and outside, where the presence of a building reaches further than its physical boundaries, outside the limits of its site, to the world beyond, at least until it meets the buildings and spaces that surround it, or the landscape that defines it. Places where the building and the site become one. But place is much more than a physical phenomenon. It includes aspects of time, culture, ethos, essence, and of course, society. We talk about our buildings being designed from the ground up and from the inside out. And in that context, I think of both ground and inside as being aspects of place. We say when everything is in its place, everything is all right. So we're not looking for the abstracted perfection of an ideal form. Instead, our designs are derived from careful study of site constraints by a process of close noticing of local conditions. The idea is to arrive at a resultant form that talks back to and makes new sense of its situation, to approach a deeper sort of simplicity through acceptance of the complicated origins that make up the shape of things. Our university building in Budapest, which you see here, is deeply embedded within and between existing buildings. It talks to them in many ways. In this image, it's a visual conversation with its 19th century neighbour. By using the same material and by pulling back from the street line to give a pocket of space, the new building invites the old one into its world. In Cork, our university art gallery floats above the ground in response to the trees, protecting their roots while allowing them to brush the windows of the building. In Connemara in the west of Ireland, we made a furniture college which responds to the texture and matter of the mountains, to the direction of the wind, and the buildings are lifted off the ground to allow the constant rain to flow under them to the bog below. Understanding the sense of place in a place or a site is always a starting point in our work, but so also is bringing to our work a sense of place learned from other places. The landscape writer Tim Robinson, who I'll talk about later, writes about the nature of place and concludes that it is the basic act of attention that makes a place out of a location. Maybe this act of bringing attention to a place is a definition of an architect's task. There are some places that we keep revisiting because of the intensity and certainty of their sense of place. We walk through the constructed landscapes of Greece and Ireland, looking at walls, terraces, hilltop forts. We're increasingly aware of a similarity between these two landscapes and between their archaic vernacular cultures. And we're also aware that that similarity is possibly only to do with our own way of looking and absorbing our own experiences of them. So we study tiny chapels in stony places where a simple seat or a step defines the threshold and establishes a sacred arrival space. Meanwhile, the pure white form might be built into the rocky landscape at the back. We look at seats and steps, at how these elements mediate between building and ground in local island chapels or in classical Athens. We enjoy the confident placemaking of the zigzag geometry of this West of Ireland pier with its rough board-marked concrete and the grass growing on its surface. Sometimes the man-made makes use of the natural. Here, a concrete promenade employs a natural rock outcrop to define containment, and they become one. Or the natural can take on the guise of the man-made. In the Aran Islands, the sea cuts a perfectly rectangular pool in a limestone platform. The ancient quarry of Ignatia, of course, is man-made, but it has been claimed by the sea and by time and become part of the landscape. So all of this grounds us in the everyday. These simple structures celebrate the ordinariness and the specialness of a threshold. Heidegger said, the boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its presencing. We've always been totally fascinated by the tower houses which exist all over the countryside across the island of Ireland, some of them built as late as the 18th century. But we were quite surprised to find a whole town of these familiar structures in the south of the Mani Peninsula and mainland Greece. So, in the conversation, I'm going to talk about different ways of talking to place. The first one is quickly to look at 4 houses, all of which in different ways are talking to the ground. We built a little house, very small, behind a restaurant on a narrow site in the town of Navan. And when we went there, we found the clients were living mostly outside because they're cooking in the kitchen and they wanted to get away from the heat. And they had this beautiful space like a courtyard, which was a remnant of a rough concrete shed, which used to be on their site. And they took their meals there and they inhabited that. So when we came to design the house, we felt they should keep their courtyard. So we designed the house as 2 buildings, the bedroom tower, a tower house, looking across a small courtyard to the living room and kitchen, which are a kind of cave. So it's the cave and the tower with the steps up to the garden and with views out over the cave to the town beyond. And I think what we particularly enjoyed is that we built it as they wanted something that had a kind of roughness, a readiness, because they wanted to bring all their stuff in and to inhabit the house in their own way. And we enjoy that sense of inhabitation, that people bring layers of their life and their belongings, and that architecture should be able to accommodate that. 20 years later in Cork, in the south of Ireland, on a really steep site, much more, in a way, had a front and back. The front faces a small street in the town. The back faces out across this very steep valley of the River Lee. So this is 2 houses in one. In the section on the left is a small house for the parents on this street, which has 1-story houses cutting down into the hill. Then further out over the hill is a 4-story, a kind of tower for the younger generation with their 3 children. And the 2 buildings speak to each other across this landscape. The house at the back looks across past the tower across to the landscape behind. The house at the front, while it's a tower, begins to expand at its lower levels out, making terraces and speaking to the landscape and making in-between spaces between inside and out. Then in Killiney, in the north edge of Dublin, looking out over the coast, there's this amazing site which had a rock outcrop in the middle and then the distant view of the sea beyond. So we made a kind of long plan, which you can see in the drawing there, a plan which stretches on the site to give you the view to the mountains and to speak to the sea, but which maneuvers itself around to protect and involve this rock outcrop. And the way we started talking to this site, I made a series of drawings and watercolours of the rock itself and how that might inform the form. And John made a sketch which he called The Sleeping Giant, which is about how, in a way, the house is like a body lying or sprawling across the site with the head looking out, the brain, the study in the head, the stomach being the kitchen, and the three legs being the bedrooms of the three little girls who were the daughters of the client. And then we worked through these drawings to eventually come to a form which sits into the site, embracing the rock, and looks out and open to the sea beyond, which includes a sense of the granite in its making. It's a granite concrete structure. The roof is like a sort of tent hanging over, and then the granite rocky outcrops are brought into the world of the house. And then from the top of the site, you look across the roof to the sea beyond. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city of Dublin, the north coast, we were building another house on a rather different site, high up a hill, looking out over the coast, the harbour and the island. In this case, the house was facing north, so it looks to the view, but it wants to bring the sun in from the south. So the house is designed as a series of long curved walls with no cross walls, so the sun can travel right through the house and light up the interior. And then, so here we see the idea of the long walls moving through and light sometimes coming in from the sides. This is a house, talking to place. This is a dug into the site house, a house that makes places within its landscape, 3 stories on one side, 2 on the other, with a series of pocket gardens. And from the garden on the south, you look right through the house to the view at the front, from the kitchen to the harbour. And it also, later, we took photographs later of the sense of inhabitation of the people and the animals who live there and how they own and claim this place. The next part is talking to the trees and the air. And this is about the gallery in Cork that I briefly referred to, which is in the university. And on the site was a very beautiful area, which you can see in the photograph, a kind of an eye-shaped circle of trees with a tarmac patch in the middle. It was a very well-loved area in the university. People sort of revered it as a landscape. So we said we would build a small, tall building and build it only on the area that was already developed, which was the footprint of the tennis court, because we wanted to preserve every tree and the roots of every tree. This is the character of the place. So what we did was to lift the gallery up in the air, to pull the structure right in, so it's highly cantilevered, so that it is in itself like a tree, and it talks to the trees. And the trees, in the end, act almost like a sort of the screen to keep the light from the windows. So in section, there's a step section of galleries in the middle, the very central one being having no light because it's totally museum controlled. And then a route through which passes under the galleries through to the river and keeping open that sense of landscape that the university enjoyed already. And this space in the middle is like a sort of inverted courtyard. And because it's inverted and there's no shadow or light, you can see right into the galleries as if there was no glass there, so there's no reflection. And there's a sense that without going in, you can be in the building. And that's something that really interests us, the idea that you can be inside a building without crossing a threshold. The ground floor plan is tiny enclosure, and the route, as you can see here, the steps and the ramp pass through. And then here you see the galleries lifted above, the route passing through, and the cafe and other public facilities opening to the ground below. And the sense of this, in a way, the building is as much about a route as it is about a place. But it's also about the trees and it's about material. And these, again, are photographs taken many years later where the wood, it's a wood-clad structure where the wood has weathered and is in this continuing conversation with the trees. So talking to real and imagined places. We've exhibited in the Venice Biennale a number of times, and every time we think about it's a slightly strange question to be asked to make an exhibition of architecture within the architecture of one of the buildings in the Arsenale. And this painting of Canaletto's The Capriccio with Palladian buildings we find really interesting because it so strongly describes a place as if the place existed, but of course the place doesn't exist. It's Canaletto's collection of a series of Palladio buildings, some built, some not built. And in a way it seemed to us like this kind of Capriccio is what one is trying to do in Venice. And the last time we exhibited was in 2018, and it was in the Corderia, and we called our installation Folding Landscape East and West. And that was because we were using 2 projects we had just finished working on competitions. One was for a huge opera house in Shanghai, where we had an idea about landscape, making a kind of Chinese garden on the roof of a building and a very open ground floor sense that you could move through a kind of public connected space with theatres above and below and performance on the roof. And so when we built this little structure in Venice, on one side was inbuilt a 1 to 10 section of the Shanghai Opera House. And the project that was in a conversation with that is a tiny project in the west of Ireland for a research centre in the home of Tim Robinson, a wonderful cartographer and writer about landscape, which is a project we continue to work on very slowly because funding is difficult. And so the place that he lives is this wonderful little village, which has always attracted artists, lots of paintings and views of it. It's a planned town by a Scottish engineer, Nimmo. So it's a one-sided straight street facing a harbour on the other side. And Robinson's house is the one on the left of that photograph at the end of the pier. And Tim and his wife, Mairead, who worked with him, lived in this house for 30 years, writing and drawing and observing the Irish landscape. And in particular, he was famous for the making of maps. And the first map was on the Aran Islands, and an Englishman, he learned to speak the Irish language because he realized you could not map a place without understanding the place names. So he actually reintroduced names which had been anglicized, brought them back to Irish, and made this amazing map, which is maybe as much about words as it is about structure or landscape. And the first time we went there preparing to do this project, we asked our students to make a map of Tim and Mairead's house, which would have the same level of detail as his map of the landscape. So they drew all the furniture and all the ornaments, everything in the house. And then these two wonderful people live in this absolutely beautiful place in a kind of genteel poverty, looking out at this landscape. And we were asked to make a project to make a research centre. Their plan was to leave the house to the university, and there would be a research centre which people, and also a place where artists and writers could come and be in residence. So our first moves were made on the site, where I made these sketches looking at what the view from each part of the site was across the sea and the landscape, thinking about how the buildings would sit in relation to the old house. And then we were on holidays in Greece, and trying to think about the project. Often when we go on holidays, we find that that's when a lot of the thinking of our projects happen. And I really like to collect stones that feel like a part of the matter of a place and try to record that. And I picked up these two stones in Greece, which were very interesting, an obsidian hard stone and a kind of tufa stone, and started to think how, in a way, that the form of these stones related to the form of what we were trying to make on this site in the west of Ireland. And we had with us just some sketch paper and pencils. And we started to think about the project and wanted to make a model. So John made a kind of model out of a pile of pencils and a pencil sharpener and a couple of stones. So he's saying that the pencils are the building, which is the artist studios. The obsidian is the meeting place in the middle. The pencil sharpener is a lift. And then this little stone is a kind of moon viewing platform. And we sent these photographs of these images back to the office so they could start to draw up and make proper models of the project, which is about embracing a landscape and embracing a view and looking out across the sea and embracing, of course, the old building that already exists on the site, which is the house that they have lived in and loved for so many years. And we work in model and in drawings, thinking about the brown card is the old house and the white card is the new building, which is a one gathering hall for exhibitions and meetings and events like this, with these big roof lights to pull in the sky and the daylight. And then it sits right on the edge of the site, made out of a kind of combination of ground up stones and shells from the site, and thinking about how we might use the materials that are used to clad the local boats in this part of Ireland. And then that it draws, as I said, the light in through this section, which then that section at 1 to 2 became the other side of our installation in Venice. And the installation in Venice, I mean, obviously the site was the Corderia, and you might say that actually the only intent of our project was to build a little flight of stairs so that you could see out the window in the Corderia to the canal beyond, because the windows are at this high level. So on the one hand, it's a simple form. It's a white painted Greek chapel. It uses steps, it uses seats, and it brings you up to look out through the window. And these are a series of sections about that idea. And then the model of the installation. And yet again, we seemed to be in Greece while we were preparing this project and looking at these chapels. I was making sketches in the landscape as John took my photograph about just how the amazing clarity and integrity of this form, but that also how it reaches the ground and how it extends itself with the seats and the benches. And our installation does the same thing. It has places you can sit. It has different ways you can walk through and explore this small, simple structure, which really is a kind of game in a way. It's a place that people could just enjoy the process, the procedure of movement, and the drawings of the two building projects are on display, and also some precious objects, stones from the site. So talking to maps, I am quite interested in maps, as Carlos has noted. So Nolly and Venice. So you've seen these images before. But so I will try to say something different about them. So it's true, every year we go to Rome in the winter, and I always bring the photocopies of Nolly. And I think one of the things that I think is amazing about Nolly is its sheer physicality, its kind of three-dimensional presence. And I wonder if it's partly, when Carlos compared it to a figure ground, I wonder if it's partly that it's drawn in hatch and not in solid black that gives a kind of texture, like the texture of a building or the scale of bricks or stones. But what's remarkable also is the first plan map of Rome. Up to then, most of the maps have been three-dimensional, so you were always looking from a particular viewpoint. So it was always about monuments, and the fabric was concealed behind the monument. But Nolly drew everything equally and didn't distinguish between time. He just made public space, whether it was indoor or outdoor. And it's true that on different years, we always stay beside the Pantheon, and this feeling that I'm drawing these lines in different colours, and they start to get mixed up and muddied because we keep going into the Pantheon so often, or around Piazza Navona. Or one year there's lines going through Sopra Minerva, another year there isn't because it's closed for restoration. So there's a sort of history in there too. But what I think is that it becomes more, by drawing on it, I come to own it, and in a way that helps me to own and understand the city. And Carlos pointed to it exactly the same images, which is strange, but this little corner over there of these, what I've written is a great set of angled spaces. We actually found ourselves in the spaces, and then I looked at the map, and the spaces felt really angled in reality, and the angle is just about discernible on the map. And I think there's something to really learn there about how to make place. When you look up at the sky, you see the angle more clearly, but on the map it's very slight. But it's really powerful in reality. And I think this is a lesson in how little you might need to bend a wall to make a place feel special. So the lessons of Rome will go on, but that is one. Venice also is a place that we spend a lot of time and continue to enjoy. It's a very different character, and we're always trying to identify what is it about a campo in Venice. And I think there's a kind of acoustic quality to spaces in Venice. And also there's this amazing sense of compression and release that you walk through really narrow places into big places. And yet it feels sure and confident. And on this map, on the left, you see John walking through the gap at the final point on the route from the Accademia to the Frari, which is one of the most walked routes in Venice. And at the last moment of this, the only way to get there is a gap about 1 meter wide. And the sense that the certainty of making spaces, also it's to the side, that have that kind of sense of compression and then release, which makes the space when you get to it much more interesting. And it has this protected, acoustically separated sense. And I think in our work, we're always trying to do that. In the Irish Film Institute, which is our first public building, carved into the centre of a city block using existing buildings, we really were trying to think about how you walked through these narrow routes to find yourself in the space that we made in the centre, which is the foyer, and that you almost can't tell whether you're inside or outside, and that was a really important aspect of that space. In the Irish Language Centre in Derry, which we made some years later, it's on a very difficult site with only one front that has windows, which is at the top of that drawing. Every other side is blocked off. So our strategy was to bring you into the middle of the block to the angled space, which is then a courtyard, it's an indoor courtyard, which brings light down from the roof. So it has its own kind of campo, which gives it its own context and its own light. And it's about having a sense of movement and a sense of dynamism in a space for culture. So talking to the city, Dublin. I mean, Dublin is where we live. It's where we've lived for many years, except for 5 years in London. And we finished this social housing project maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where we really were trying to build a little piece of Dublin, because I think you could say that housing, in making housing, you are building the city. It's the place people live, it's the background of that particular city and its cultural expression. And to start the project, we made a study of many historic maps, and then we redrew them with our site, which is the kind of brown patch on the right, on the map. And we identified certain routes that survived through hundreds of years and tried to reproduce them. But when we arrived on the scene, the reason the project existed was because the road engineers in the city had driven a huge new road through this area, which is the white dotted line, and our site was the reddish patch on the left. And in a way, it's like a sort of, it's like an attack, an insult to the city, that the insult of just cutting through existing Georgian houses that have been there for years. So we felt our project had to be to remake, almost like a sort of repair, like putting a bandage on the open wounds that they had made. So our idea was to make, on the street side, a street holding building, but that has got slight angles learned from Rome and Venice, that pulls back, which also gives a threshold to the people whose front doors are on the street. And a building which steps down in the middle because this is the south side and we wanted to bring the sun somehow in through the building. And then we were looking at Georgian Dublin and thinking about the scale and the material of brick and the way in which the scale is modulated. So we have double height balconies in apartments which are only 1 story high to bring more light and air into the people living there. And then in plan, it's very narrow when it faces the noisy street, and then it opens into a triangular space, a kind of campo in the city. And our concept was that there would be this triangular, it's timber yard. The site was previously a timber yard. The housing is called timber yard. There would be this space with doors and windows and balconies overlooking it. But maybe really importantly, that through the narrow gap, it borrows a piece of early industrial architecture from a Georgian distillery, which is across the street. So the building is in conversation with the form and shape and scale of other buildings nearby. On the other side, where the wide part of the campo looks out, where there are smaller 2-story houses, streets and streets of houses, are building steps and angles down to belong to that world of residential life in the city. And we're interested in the kind of actual pattern and fabric of how, and the incredible flexibility of brick, which on the one hand is like a walled surface, but it also, things can pull and push. And our observation that in Georgian Dublin, in the photo on the left, that because every room has the windows in the middle, the windows on the ground floor don't line up with the windows above. So there's this kind of interesting pull in the brick patterning. And the brick can do that. It can stretch and it can have openings in different places. So, sorry, I went the wrong way. So when we're trying to make, social housing, very small apartments with lots of different size rooms and windows, we were using the lesson of the Georgian to think about how the pattern of the openings could actually make this surface, but also make the right kind and scale of openings that are wanted. And then in that yard, we have trees and planters and seats and ways of recognizing the moment of threshold, a place where this little child keeps playing on different parts of this structure, and where the entrance to the homes are recessed to give you a sense of threshold to your house. And we're trying to make something that speaks back to the richness of the original city and that can sit within the skyline of Dublin, which is a relatively low city with these, what we call mountains, but hills behind. And so that was finished maybe 12 years ago, and finally now we've been appointed by the City Council to make 3 new urban housing projects, social housing again, which we're really excited about, using a higher scale this time because the housing crisis is so intense that we need to build a lot of houses in Dublin. But also that we're building, in this case, in a kind of industrial part of the city where the Guinness brewery was, with lots of 10, 11-story stone and brick buildings. So our project is to make a courtyard of deck access housing, which has a kind of protected garden. And I think in making social housing, it's not just the apartment, it's the route from the public world where you get off the bus, through a gate into a garden where there are flowers, where there are seats, up a deck where is planting, where you meet your neighbours until you get to the front door. So I think that sense of the way home is as much part of how people have to live as what happens when you get in the door. So we're thinking about the deck having seats and tables and recesses and windows so that there is a sense of belonging to the place and an opportunity to relate to neighbours. So the city we know best after Dublin is London, because we lived there for 5 years, and we were really delighted to be appointed to make the student centre for the LSE in a very dense, typical part of London where the medieval city pattern still exists, but has been cut through by early 20th century moves on a very small site with a very varied brief where there's no repetition. Every floor has different accommodation, different sizes. So there were lots of factors in the site which influenced the making of this building, which is the student centre in the middle of a campus which is a piece of city. It's public. The LSE campus is just part of the city. It's not a separately closed-off field. So our first instinct was that it was such a kind of bricky place that we knew we wanted to build in brick, and then we wanted to make a building which was singular and recognisable so that the students from all the surrounding buildings would say that that's our place, that's our palace. And it's on this corner right beside Lincoln's Inn Fields. So on the left is the huge Kingsway, and Kingsway is the street which is drawn in the middle of that in a kind of orange, which was driven through in the 1905. So you can see on this map that the pattern of medieval streets ran in and was simply cut by Kingsway, and where the big black cross is our site, which sits somehow just on the edge of that geometric relationship, and is a triangular site with lots of converging streets reaching it. So when we're thinking about our initial ideas, sketching, we're thinking on the one hand about Venice, about this amazing moment just off the Grand Canal where the two buildings slide past each other and almost seem to be in movement, although they're obviously still, but there's a kind of dynamic. And that's one sketch plan John was working on about how to bring the lanes that make up that context into the building we're making. At the same time, of course, we're thinking about Rome, and in this case, it's about that sense, about a kind of narrow compression opening out to something big, which you have partial views of. So it was a competition, and in the competition, we were thinking very much about the sense of a public realm. And although the site was very small, we felt the need to give back a piece of outdoor space. So there's a triangular space here which we pulled back to make a kind of threshold where students could gather before they go into the building. And then we're very much thinking, this is the competition plan, about movement and dynamic within a space, because the building has so many different activities and you needed to be able to understand them all. So a second kind of map making that I engage in is that when maybe about 10 years ago in Greece, I started to make maps representing the swims I was taking into the harbour. And I suppose if you're doing the same thing every day, you begin to think about how to represent it. So this drawing shows the house we're staying in here on the edge of the harbour side. And at the top, you can just see the shape here is the shape of the enclosing bay, and the yellow is the reflection of the mountain. And then every day I will, between all the boats that are moored outside, I'll take these different swims around a boat. And then I'll record it. And a bit like the Nolly experience, in this case, if I swim in one direction one day and I look at the map, I think, I wonder what it's like if you swim around that boat. And there's something really interesting about the thing of being suspended in water, because in a way water is like space, but it's also solid. And so when swimming here, because I was making the map, I had a real sense of myself in space in this harbour, and about how interesting it was to move differently around things like these boats, which are sort of semi-static because they're moored and they might not be there the next day. So it's a kind of speculation on what is solid and what isn't and how movement occurs. And this became something we were thinking about making the plan of the LSE, but also the site is so small that we designed the competition entry as a series of perspectives looking down these narrow lanes. So it's about a view, a particular view that you only see. We wanted to see how could you see the entrance canopy as you moved down this lane. And then we worked on the idea of brick, the brick basket, that there is solid brick, but there's perforated brick, and the brick pulls apart sometimes to let light in to rooms that need a semi-privacy, like a prayer room or a dance studio. And then other places, the brick is solid. So we were trying to make something that feels like a kind of brick mountain, but that has also got a perforate aspect. And then the drawing of the geometry of the building comes out of drawing the sight lines of the site, the kind of inherent geometric forces that are on that site, and making the plan around those. And then the plan with its setback triangle, where on the ground floor, there's very little accommodation, but you look down into there's a pub, and you look down into the venue space, and you move up this very big stairs, which winds around the lift. So the stair out, there's a spiral stair, then you come up and you move around the lift. And somehow, and then the canopy outside, the outdoor space has architecture. It's got a glazed steel structured canopy. And then as you move up, you're like something in Marcel Duchamp's painting, that there's the sense of the stairs as being a dynamic space is really important, as being a place of movement, but also a place of rest. So there are always seats, there are places to stand out. As you go through the building, the stairs winds you past all the different activities so that as many as possible of the activities in the building remain public. There are windows from the gym onto the stairs, there's windows from the Students' Union offices. So you get this, even though you're up 3 floors, you feel you're part of the kind of canted lane that is the stairs that moves up through the building. And maybe particularly the moments where we made this graphic on the lift shaft, which uses a kind of colour coding. It's coming around the lift shaft is a bit like the sense of moving around the boats in the harbour, that there is this feeling of continuous movement, but also places to stop and rest. And I think that idea of nooks and crannies, places aside that people can rest, especially in a building for students where you can't really predict the activities, is very important. And we had this sense in the competition that what the building was like a kind of warehouse, a lived-in warehouse, overlaid with maybe a club, a gentleman's club. And so the competition drawing on the left, and then the photograph of looking down into that canopy. And the building at night is a kind of, it's like a lantern in the city section. It's very intensely built. It's very packed full of stuff. So there's a deep basement, 2 stories, where there's a venue where they have parties and nightclubs and book fairs. But from the street, you can look through this void and you can see the lights of the band playing, and also daylight comes in the back. So we didn't want to make a kind of dark basement. We wanted this sense that every part of this building was part of the almost pulsing life of the student activity. And then very important for us was the sense of continuity beyond the site. We designed the public realm, the landscape, and they pedestrianised the street. So the materials and the sense and geometry of the building extend into the landscape and into these street furniture elements, which we designed to carry a sense of the presence of the building beyond its presence. I mean, sometimes the things that we're doing, of course, actually are talking to old buildings. And we've actually done quite a lot of projects working in existing buildings, and always find it really exciting and interesting to do that. In Vienna, Vienna, that's a Freudian slip, I'll explain later. In Budapest, Central European University, was a competition we were invited to participate in, where they had a series of adjoining buildings, old 19th and some 20th century buildings, which were disconnected, and they needed to connect them to make a single campus. And I suppose what we enjoyed here was that sense of moving into and between the old buildings, using the old materials, carving out new space. It was on a remarkable site very near the centre, with a view down to the Danube from one street, and then it was related to the cathedral. But what we particularly noted, that this corner of the site where the place for the new building had this axial view to the River Danube, which you can see in that photograph too. So we always had the idea that we would put a new entrance visually connected to the Danube. And the other sense was that the old buildings on the site were courtyard buildings, and Budapest is absolutely a city of courtyards, so different from Dublin and London. Every plot is big, every plot is built around a courtyard, often many courtyards. In this sort of study diagram we did, one building we looked at is called the House of 7 Courtyards. So this was our starting point, was that the building, our proposal would be about courtyards. It would be about keeping the existing buildings that were to be kept and intensifying the sense of their relationship with courtyards, bringing the courtyards into the life of the university rather than excluding them as they were now. So we made study models about this. And maybe the most important drawing we made was this one, to say that you don't knock down all the stuff that's in behind the street. You keep it, but what you do is you open up and make connections, so that instead of being the buildings, which at that time were totally separate from each other, now become one connected, kind of interconnected organism. So we set about, the 2 parts mainly were built. One was a reworking of an existing building, which you see on the left in that photo. And then, so when we're trying to think about this idea about cutting through, how do you do it? There's an amazing thing in Rome about the sort of palimpsest of different ages layered up. And at the Portico d'Ottavia, Rome, there's a man looking at his little taverna, and you can see that the ground is at a totally different level than it was before, because of the capital of the column, and the sense that the ancient, the Renaissance, the contemporary are all overlaid, and there are ways of making cuts through. And then Gordon Clark's amazing project called Conical Intersert, which he made in Paris on the buildings which were demolished to make the Pompidou Centre, where he just cut through and a series of different buildings making this incredible installation, but which also somehow demonstrated that buildings, by cutting through, they still stay themselves, but they become something new through their connection. So our concept maybe is best described in this drawing, where we took existing old courtyards and roofed them for reasons of environmental control. And then in the new building, we make new courtyards which relate to the courtyards in the old. So one of the issues was the university, they never went into the courtyards because they were too small and they were freezing in winter and too hot in the summer. So our proposal was to make the courtyards part of the life of the university, to roof them, to make a thermal strategy which allowed them to be cool enough in summer to use and warm enough in winter, and then to make these bridges and connections through. So there are, on the left is the old building with this big angled roof light, which has many reasons, but mostly to do with the thermal control of the space, also to do with keeping fresh air for the windows on the rooms on the right. And then on the right is our new building, which is a library and many other facilities in that university. So on the right is a building which has at the bottom a lecture hall and a conference centre, and eventually becomes a library with its own courtyard. This is one of the old courtyards which is now re-roofed, seen from inside and out. And then at the top of the building we made a roof garden which looks out towards the Hungarian Parliament, which also gives the university a kind of outdoor ground which they never had before, with trees and vegetable gardens and places for seminars and cinema. And then at the ground, at the bottom, again we pulled back a little bit from the street and made in this beautiful Hungarian stone solid benches that mark the entrance with a view down into the lecture room from the street. And the left-hand side is the new building, which has a conference centre, and the right-hand side is the existing building, which we've refurbished. And the entrance to the new building is to one side because the conference room needed to be very wide. And in a way, that means that this entrance passes between old and new. And we made the wall defining the gap between the old and the new. We reused existing bricks which were collected in the demolition of some other buildings in the area to make this, to indicate the age of the wall on the left. And then the new building has its spaces and its staircases moving up through. In the new building, when you look through to the library, you look through one of its small courts towards the city. And on the left, the projecting red box is from the old building, which is on this plan. So in the old building, you come through and you look through that courtyard into them. Then you can see also in the photograph what you're looking at, which is the different floors of the university library, which is a big roof-lit library, again, to do with ventilation and climate control. And then students can choose to sit looking right out the window towards the Danube, or they can sit in quieter places in the library. And this sense of looking towards the Danube maybe brings me back to the outside of the building, which we made in this stone, a scuto stone, which comes from an ancient quarry north of Budapest, which has been in use since Roman times. And when we went to the quarry, we were allowed to pick the actual stone that would become the stone that's clad our building. But what really struck us was that the shape of the quarry itself, with these 3-story high steps, reminded us in a way of the form of our own. It was like our project was already built in the quarry. And we really enjoyed the texture with these holes in the stone, with this kind of three-dimensionality of a flat material. And then this image I showed you before, looking this conversation with the building across the road in the same stone, and eventually our building, which you see on the right here, will weather to be like that stone. The building had 3 phases, and the first phase is finished, which you see on the right there, the photograph of our new building and the refurbishment. On the left is what should have been phase 2, which is on another street right on the other side of the block, which was going to be a kind of faculty office building. And we had just got tenders back from that when the Hungarian Parliament closed the university because they disapproved of its liberal agenda. And after a number of years of fighting, the university has actually now moved to Vienna, although this building is still in use, but nobody knows quite what its future will be. So for us, that's a quite sad story at the end. Talking to another old building, and in this case, old friends too, in Liverpool. John and I both worked for Jim Sterling, as I think Carlos mentioned, and he became a really important mentor to us, and we became very friendly with him, and we kept in touch after we left his office and moved back to Ireland. And Sterling was a graduate of Liverpool School of Architecture, as were many other people whose works we knew and admired, like the writer Bob Maxwell. So when we were invited to this competition to make a new school of architecture in Liverpool, we were really delighted to accept the challenge. In fact, it was not a new school, it was to take the existing school with all its phases and add another part. One of the most interesting things about this competition was that the students in the School of Architecture were involved in the whole structure of the competition and in the selection of architects. So it went from 18 to 9 to 6, and at each stage, the 18 architects' work was reviewed by all the students, and they voted and had mass meetings about who should be on the list to design their building. And indeed, Johanni was one of the assessors of this project. And when the 6 presented our projects on the final day, we presented them not just to the jury, but to the community of the school. So it was quite intimidating in a way, because we were presenting to the people who would be the future users. And then the students were allowed to talk to the jury and give them their opinions during the day. And at the end of that day, the decision was announced that we had won the competition by Kenneth Frampton, who was the chair of the jurors. And in approaching this, we had sort of 5 themes in our competition, and the first one was place, context, and scale. And we just wanted to think about how our new building would sit on the ground in Liverpool, but connecting to a set of existing buildings which were part of the school, but also connecting beyond to views of the cathedral and other elements. So we were thinking in terms of place, of building, designing from the ground up, and these are some sketches overlaying plan and 3-dimensional form and models to think about how this School of Architecture, how would we bring it to place. The second was about space, character, and atmosphere, and this, I suppose, is very much to do with designing from the inside. So we thought about what is a studio, what's an architecture studio, how the life and dynamic of a studio, how students in one studio overlap and talk to people in another. So we made a lot of drawings of how the spaces would feel like inside, how they would connect to each other visually, and then how the building in its plan would also talk to the outside beyond. And in that the studio at the top of the building is a timber structure, 30-meter timber span, which sits on top of a solid base, so that the studio is open and interconnected right across the building. Organisation, I mean, for us, as always, everything begins with the plan, and of course maps are plans. So all my obsession with maps is also about understanding how to make plans. And so this building had started life, it was the oldest school of architecture in Britain, started life in a set of Georgian houses on a square. In the 1930s, a building was built here called the Riley Building, or it's called a number of different names, but which was a courtyard building when it was built in this position. And then the site now for the new building was here beyond that. So it was like adding a third element to this to the conversation that had been going on. And so it was the competition was, for us, we took that connection very seriously. We spent a lot of time untangling how the old stairs could be improved and how the lift could be moved, so we would have a sense of open connection through from the old building, through at different levels, through all to the new part. So the sense of opening up these routes was really important, because I think our motto was a connected school. We didn't want the school to feel like it was 3 parts. We wanted to feel like it connected and that it had a meaningful whole. So you can see here the movement from the old to the Riley Building to our proposal, all of which use brick, but in different ways as it befits their time. So we had this idea of the base being solid and then that the roof would be timber above. But we thought a lot about the sort of 3-dimensional expression of the tectonic, how that was made, and we used very drawings that we had learned from working with Sterling about a lot of worm's eye and axonometric drawings, because in a way we were having a conversation with Jim Sterling in making this project. We used robust materials using thermal mass, natural light, ventilation, which we think still in the end are going to be essential things in terms of the continuing discussion about climate and about the climate inside buildings. And then that the building has this conversation with the kind of incredible Liverpool modern cathedral in the distance, and that the building has covered spaces on the outside, but that in the end, on a rainy day in Liverpool, it's a kind of bright, welcoming place that would invite you in. I'm going to finish now by talking about one project which involves 2 buildings for us in London. And the reason I'm saying conversations with cultural place is that it's in a part of London which, in a way, doesn't have as much historic traces as other parts of the city we've worked in. It's the site of the London Olympics. So in a way, the context is a kind of strange one of bits of permanent Olympic buildings and then other places where the site has been erased by temporary things that were there in the Olympics. But the site that we're working on is this very narrow sliver of land, and it was a master plan competition which we did with Allies and Morrison and Architecturia. And it was to make a cultural quarter for the East End of London post-Olympics, with a museum for the Victoria and Albert, a new dance theatre for Sadler's Wells, a performing place for the BBC, and a fashion college, and lots of housing. So our project, I mean, this elevation is a kind of X-ray of the scale of the project. It's a very high-scale building project. So on the left, so the housing is to the left, which is the red tower and the three white ones. The V&A Museum is in the middle, and Sadler's Wells is on the end. So in our practice, we are responsible for designing the housing tower at the end, the V&A Museum here, and the Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre. And the other parts are being done by the other two architects who are in this collaboration. And so, in a sense, we're trying to understand place. We're looking at historic maps. It was always an industrial place. It was always full of railway lines and roads. And the main thing we noted that all the buildings on the site, which is here, all of the buildings always stretched from the river to the road or the railway. So there was a sense of a kind of like strip farming. And that was the grain of the site, which was kind of a big grain. It's not like a residential grain. And we're imagining in the future, because it's all about public transport, it's full of trains and tracks and roads, that you will look from the train and see this new development. The building, Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre is this one, and then immediately after that starts our project. The Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre is beside the Aquatic Centre. So the Sadler's Wells project is, it's a dance theatre, it's a flexible space. Sadler's Wells have a big 1,500-seat theatre for dance in London, and they wanted a more flexible experimental space for 500 people, but also to make a school of dance. So there's 6 studios for learning choreography and kind of high-level dance, but also studios for local kids to learn hip-hop and other forms of dance. So their brief is very much about bringing dance to the community in the East End of London and introducing people to the idea of dance. And our building is... we developed this phrase with the client early on: the building should feel ready for work. So its character comes to some extent out of the industrial past of the site. And we wanted to express the studios, so the 3 peaked roofs are the upper studios where there's north light coming in. And then the building is very open on its lower levels to invite people in. And in section on the site, you can see the Zaha Hadid Aquatic Centre is this big swooping roof. So the building sits on a big level change between the road below where the stage is and where they get in, and the public enter at this level. So there's a kind of public engagement with a big foyer that looks at the Aquatic Centre, and there's various terraces as you move up through the building that also look out to that. And we were trying to think, what's a dance theatre? How do you work with studios? What's the kind of form of it? And we got interested in these choreographic drawings. I think this might be an Andy Warhol drawing of choreography, but about the idea of rhythm and stepping and repeating the same thing. So our building, which has 6 studios, has 3 studios with these north light roofs on this side, and then another big studio with north light roofs on that side, and they sort of step around the order of the main circulation bar which runs through here, and then the highest thing of all is the fly tower. And we worked a lot in model, just trying to think, it's a corner building, how the building articulates itself and how it expresses something about its use. And the materials, we're making it in, the external materials are clay, so it's brick and clay tiles, again in response to the context, but also because large parts of this building would be bare with no windows because of fly towers in it and performance space. And we find that the character and texture of brick works really well for making a wall which speaks to you while it might not have windows. And the section is very simple, 3 studios over 2 studios, and the foyer space taking its rhythm from the studios above with 1 double height space which is overlooked by the studios. And then in the other direction, the performance space with this retractable seating, big studio at the top with this terrace looking out over the Aquatic Centre. And the foyer wraps around the solid mass of the auditorium. And the foyer we envisaged as a kind of series of interconnected spaces. It's one space, but it's lots of spaces. So the staircase makes a kind of narrow space, a narrow moment between the first space into a corner space. So we're thinking about our Roman and Venetian experience of space and making something that feels flowing, but also has moments of individuality within it. And then the top drawing is the section through the foyer showing how The studios overlook it from above. And then there's a big canopy which forms a kind of inside-outside space on the south side where people can sit around outside but also come inside. And whereas one of the studios opens onto a balcony which looks over this. So there is a big effort in the facade of the building to make a kind of complex relationship with the world beyond. And then the plan, as I say, it's a simple square building really, with 4 studios on this level, expressed in the axonometric. In thinking about how to make the material of the building and to make these solid fly tower form, having worked in brick in the LSE building, we were very interested in the kind of textural qualities of brick. And Rome, the Aurelian walls in Rome, when we were walking around one day, we suddenly realized, oh, that feels like just a whole series of fly towers all connected, because these projecting towers feel exactly like the kind of scale and character of the fly tower. So we started working with how to make brick, how to make different kinds of texture. We're working with a brick company north of Venice who make beautiful handmade bricks, but they also make big brick tiles. So we've been over and back a number of times before travel was restricted by the pandemic, and working with them on a combination of handmade and machine-made bricks to make a kind of three-dimensionality where there's shadow and recess over windows or where there aren't windows, which eventually becomes this north elevation, which is the fly tower, with its cranking stairs going up to it, with various bits of projecting corbelled brickwork to bring something of the kind of craft of brick into the making of the building. As you approach it from the shopping centre, you see there's more brickwork at the entrance here, and then at night the building should be open and welcoming to everybody on the corner of this amazing place. The V&A Museum, which is in the same site but in the middle, also its site section is quite important because it's a 5-story building and all the stories are open to the public, but it's actually quite small, and it sits opposite the main stadium of it's now West Ham Stadium, the Olympic Stadium, across a river. So it's also making a kind of conversation by having public terraces and by cutting in at the bottom. When we were trying to think, a lot of it is a changing exhibition space, so it's going to be totally dark space with exhibitions that are changing. So the architecture of most of the galleries is not permanent. We were trying to think about how do you make a building which has an external expression but has something slightly different going on the inside. And we were at the National Gallery in Ireland looking at the only Vermeer owned by the National Gallery, which is a really beautiful painting. And I sort of got a bit obsessed with the sleeve. Because I suddenly thought that the sleeve of this woman's dress looked like a building or had a sort of spatial and formal quality, and the relationship between the sleeve and the arm as being two things. That's her arm, but it's not the shape of an arm. So John started making these sketches because what we had to do was make galleries which were almost separate from and inside the external form of the building. So the first sketches actually grew out of that. And just continuing the sartorial reference, there's a wonderful film by Wim Wenders called A Notebook on Cities and Clothes about the designer Yohji Yamamoto, where Wim Wenders, I think it starts when he bought a shirt and a jacket of Wenders, of Yamamoto, and he ends up saying that he had the strange sensation that when he was wearing this jacket and this shirt, he said, I have no other words for it. I was wearing the shirt itself and the jacket itself, and in them I was myself. I felt protected like a knight in his armour by a shirt and a jacket. So this sense of armour or protection and by form is really interesting. And then in this film there's wonderful footage of Yamamoto as the models are about to walk on the catwalk with the scissors cutting pieces and changing and actually adjusting the clothes as they head out. So we found that very inspiring. And at the same time as this was happening, the V&A had an exhibition about the designer Balenciaga, Spanish designer. And in the exhibition, there were lots of his clothes, but also an amazing photograph, which is the middle one there, which was an X-ray of a Balenciaga dress, which shows the outside of the dress, but then these kind of structures that were in it to hold the dress in a certain shape. So we started to think about the drawings of our building for the museum as being a bit like an X-ray, so that there's the coat, the jacket that it's wearing, and then there's the kind of body itself inside. And this engineer's drawing, which is a kind of strange drawing of how a lot of things go into the ground. But in a way, this engineer's drawing continues this sense of the X-ray, because it's a steel structure, but it's going to be clad in precast concrete. So it's, in a way, this drawing is of the insides of the building. And in fact, the stage it's at on site now is that it is just at that stage that the steel, well, actually, the steel structure is going up, and this week the precast has started to go on. But it's that the sense of the inside and the outside is really important. And in the end, the building sits on the site with its jacket, and where the space between the galleries and the outside occurs is, Yohji Yamamoto talks about the ma, or it's a Japanese concept, the ma, which is the space between, say, the arm and the sleeve, the in-between space. And in our building, that's where the staircases and the public circulation happen, and moments where you can come and look out a window, because obviously in the galleries you can't. So we worked through model and drawings, and then the building has, it sits in a straddling position. At the lower level, you can enter it from across a little bridge from the Olympic Park into a public space here, which is a small cafe which opens out onto the site. And then at the upper level, you can enter it from a long walkway from Sadler's Wells, which brings you in to the entrance space here and to the shop and the beginning of the stairs winding its way up and down in between first exhibition spaces here. So the exhibition spaces are mostly simple rectangles, and the crinkled space around them is the space of movement and the space of public occupation. As you can see in this drawing, where the staircases and the shops form a kind of crust to protect the undaylit galleries. And we made section models and stair models also to just think about that moment of the in-between, the moment of the public experience, which is other than the experience of the exhibition, the moment where you come and find yourself, you see, oh, I'm on the Olympic site, I can see the Olympic Stadium opposite, but the building, all the time you're pulling back from the outside. On the left is one of our first samples of, we've got this very beautiful precast concrete being made by an Irish precast concrete maker. And we had this idea of having the building would have, because it's quite solid, that it would have, it's a design museum, so it has a kind of craft, and there's lines and drawings inscribed on the precast, and there are indents and protrusions, which are V-shaped, and which we thought of maybe a bit like a V and an A, which sort of characterize and give scale to the building. So within its elevation, you can see here that we have drawn different kinds of lines. There are the horizontal lines, and then there are other angled lines, which represent different scales of indents and pointy bits. And these are the samples just before they started putting them on site of the precast. Very big pieces of precast concrete, very beautiful texture and colour, which then you see that on some sides there are angle cuts. On the sort of shadow side is just vertical lines. Thank you. Sorry, an abrupt end.
Sheila, for such a beautiful, such a wonderful talk, in which you not only address the topic frontally, this notion of conversation with sight, but the very wide understanding of architecture as a form of conversation with everything, with history, with place, also even with Jim Sterling, which I think in the end it's a beautiful way of putting that everything is a way of engaging in a dialogue. And I think that also for the students we have in the room, it's for me very important to say how, apart from a very rich variety of representation techniques, there's lots of thoughts in each project that speaks of the way an architect looks at architecture and at the city. So that also something I kind of said yesterday, that as opposed to perhaps an architectural critic or an architectural historian, we try to share, we see history, we see places as a series of shared problems, right? That just you identified with something, normally the project you have on the drawing table, and then you see lots of things that otherwise you wouldn't see. I was wondering whether there were any questions for Sheila, or any thoughts, any comments? Please don't be shy. I think it's just, in a sense, of course, we don't need to force it, but it's a privilege that we have such an incredible roster of speakers. We had Anna Caton yesterday here, and we were all tired, but it's a shame that nobody really engaged in conversation with them. Is there one? I cannot see anything. Who's that?
Hello. Thank you very much for an amazing lecture.
Who's speaking?
Me.
Oh.
Hello. Perhaps this is an abstract method of understanding, but it seems like in the final project of the V&A, it was interesting. In the beginning, you mentioned that when it came to the Nolly maps, that there was this texture of a hatch, and it seems like when it came to the facade now, it's almost this hatch returned. So perhaps it's a bit of a ridiculous question, but do you also approach facades as a map as well?
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice question. I think that's definitely true in this building because, unlike many buildings, it's not one where there are lots of windows from spaces that look out. It's more like the building is a container, and it's a container of made objects. So yes, I think the texture was really important, and the changing scale of the texture on the building. You know, in the V&A building in South Kensington, I remember we were there once and noting on one of the doorways there's a stone, or maybe stone, I think, door surround, and there's little lizards carved into the stone, and which I thought was really beautiful, and it's probably to do with some part of the display which has things to do with animals. So we had this thought that a building that's for exhibiting craft, because mostly it will be craft objects, should have a crafted feeling. And the part of the craft is the architect's craft of a drawing on the building. I don't think we consciously thought about it as a map, but I do think that if it was a completely flat, it would be quite different. We've never used precast concrete before. We were a little bit nervous, and then we began to realize that there is a real craft in the making of these materials. And we went to visit the factory and were astounded at the way that they can make such beautiful formwork, molds, and then cast into them. But actually there's lots of room for variety, because we thought it was very mass-produced, but it's not, because each panel is cast. So you can make slight changes in the texture of the panels. And in a way, they will also show, as all materials do, some differences related to maybe the day they were made or the weather when they were curing, all of which I think that aspect I didn't really talk about today, about time. And so the incisions into the building are also to encourage it not to weather in a flat way. So we imagine that the V's that go in, that rain will run down those and it will weather in one way, and the projecting V's will weather differently, which is maybe about the facade of the building telling its own story about its age and about its time and about its construction, all of which I think are very important. But it seemed, particularly because it was a craft museum, that would be part of its craft, would be part of its expression.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.